process governance, how institutions become institutions often appear stable: the state, the ministry, the court, the regulator. The market, the organization, each seems to possess a settled identity. But institutions are not static objects. They persist because authority, relationships, classifications, routines, resources, expectations, and material systems are continuously reproduced. What appears stable is not the absence of change, it is patterned continuity within change. An institution does not first exist and then begin operating. It exists because its operation is being reproduced. A ministry persists even as ministers, officials, policies, and technologies change. A court persists despite changing judges, cases, and interpretations. A market persists through the continuous entry and departure of participants. The visible institution is therefore the temporary form taken by an ongoing process. This is the starting point of process governance. Institutional continuity is not always evidence of institutional health. A system may continue functioning because other actors absorb its contradictions. Employees absorb expanding workloads. Households compensate for inadequate public services. Maintenance is deferred. Communities inherit environmental risk. Future governments inherit obligations that present governments refuse to recognize. The institution appears stable because the pressure has been transferred elsewhere. Process governance calls this compensatory stability. The institution survives, but only by consuming the resilience of others. Institutional failure does not always arrive as an external shock. It may be produced through the successful continuation of ordinary practice. A transport authority repeatedly defers maintenance. A health system preserves service levels by increasing staff workload. A regulator repeatedly accepts industry-provided evidence because independent investigation is expensive. Each decision may appear reasonable in isolation. Together they produce failure. The most important question is therefore not only is the institution functioning, it is what future is the institution producing by continuing to operate as it currently does. Process governance draws its philosophical foundation from Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead challenged the idea that reality is fundamentally composed of static substances. What exists has become. What persists continues becoming. Every event inherits prior conditions, selects and integrates them, reaches a determinate form, and then becomes part of the conditions inherited by what follows. Applied to governance, this means that every decision receives a world it did not create. It inherits law, precedent, debt, infrastructure, institutional memory, political pressure, public expectation, and unequal distributions of power. The decision then enters the world as a new condition. One actor's decision becomes another actor's inherited reality. The formal process grammar is inheritance, selection, integration, determination, transition, reproduction. A governance occasion begins by inheriting prior conditions. It selects which signals and histories will count. It integrates competing pressures and constraints. It produces a determination. That determination enters the world through transition. And the resulting pattern is either reproduced, modified, or disrupted by what follows. This process occurs in budgets, planning decisions, regulatory rulings, judicial judgments, restructures, technopilotal deployments, and emergency measures. The publication also draws upon geological analysis, not because institutions are rocks and not because political crises are earthquakes. Geology is useful because it reveals process architectures that conventional institutional analysis often overlooks. Stratification reveals accumulated history. Stress reveals unresolved pressure. Faults reveal recurrent pathways of failure. Thresholds reveal nonlinear change. Rupture reveals the breakdown of an existing form. Stress transfer reveals how failure moves across boundaries. Erosion and deposition reveal how institutions weaken and accumulate gradually. These are not decorative metaphors.
They are relational principles tested for structural correspondence. Institutional boundaries are often assumed to contain responsibility and risk, but under pressure, boundaries can transmit disruption. A funding reduction in one agency becomes workload in another. A private efficiency gain becomes a public cost. A deferred infrastructure obligation becomes environmental harm. A regulatory failure becomes a legitimacy crisis. The boundary remains visible, but its governing function has changed. Process governance, therefore, follows the movement of information, authority, money, risk, delay, burden, and consensus.
Process governance does not oppose structure and process. Structure is process that has acquired durability. Recurring practice becomes structural when it begins constraining what can happen next. A temporary workaround becomes normal. An informal reporting route becomes real authority. A performance measure becomes the definition of success. A budget rule becomes an inherited limit. Structure carries history into the present. It enables coordination. It also preserves previous exclusions, inequalities, and settlements. Process philosophy and geology can explain how institutions become stable, accumulate pressure, and cross thresholds, but explanation is not enough. Human institutions possess intention, responsibility, legitimacy, and moral agency. For that reason, process governance is situated within philosophical intelligence. It asks, what kind of issue is being governed? What forms of intervention are possible? What actions are admissible? Who absorbs the burden? Who receives the gains? Who inherits the cost? What forms of continuity remain legitimate? What future possibilities are being closed? The publication converts the theory into a practical architecture. It introduces instruments for examining institutional history, accumulated stress, recurrent failure pathways, boundary behavior, process fields, system states, downstream consequences, responsibility, and admissibility. The objective is not merely to explain why an institution failed. It is to identify where intervention remains possible before contradiction becomes rupture. Every institution receives a world it did not fully choose. It receives histories, assets, laws, debts, traumas, capabilities, inequalities, and expectations. It then acts through action. It changes. What later institutions will receive? Governance is therefore responsibility for transition between inheritances. Its success cannot be measured only by whether the institution acts, delivers, or survives. It must also be measured by whether the process through which it becomes remains intelligible, operable, admissible, legitimate, responsible, correctable, and regenerative. The new Philosophical Intelligence Institute publication, Process Governance, a Whiteheadian architecture of institutional becoming, develops this theory across philosophy, institutional analysis, geology, governance method, and applied practice. It examines how institutions inherit, stabilize, accumulate contradiction, transfer pressure, rupture, recover, and transform. It also provides protocols, audits, matrices, diagnostic tools, and application worksheets for practical use. Governance is not merely the management of what exists. It is responsibility for the conditions under which the next institutional world becomes possible. Governance is, finally, the discipline of governing what becomes. Philosophical Intelligence Institute. Frameworks turn complexity into admissible decisions.